My name is Jake. I'm 32 years old and I work as a food delivery driver in the small town of Oak Ridge, North Carolina. I've been delivering food for the past 5 years, and in that time I've seen all sorts of things, some funny, some strange, and some that still make my skin crawl. But nothing compares to the events I experienced a few months ago. I'm still not sure what happened, but I'll never forget that night. It all started like any other shift. I had just finished delivering a meal to a regular customer, and I was taking a quick break when my phone buzzed. It was a new order, a large pizza and a couple of sides. The address caught my attention. It was an old, rundown house on the outskirts of town, a place that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. I've driven by it hundreds of times, but I never thought anyone would live there. I wasn't sure if the system had just sent me an old address by mistake, but I clicked accept and began driving. The closer I got to the house, the more uneasy I felt. The trees around the property were overgrown, and the house looked like it had been left to rot. Windows were boarded up, and the front porch looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. I slowed down as I approached the driveway, trying to shake off the strange feeling crawling up my spine. I thought about cancelling the order, but the customer had already paid, and I didn't want to risk a complaint. I parked my car near the front gate and grabbed the food. There was no one in sight. I knocked on the front door, my hand trembling a little. The door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the dark doorway. He had a strange smile on his face, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair was messy, like he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. He looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Thank you for the food," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Come inside. I'll pay you." I hesitated for a moment. Something about the way he spoke gave me the chills. But I didn't want to be rude, so I handed him the pizza and sides. He took the bags from my hands without saying another word, still smiling that unsettling smile. I turned to leave, but he suddenly spoke again. "Don't forget to check the door when you come back." I paused, confused, and looked back at him, but he just stared at me, his smile never fading. I didn't know what he meant, but I nodded and left. As I walked back to my car, I felt an odd sense of discomfort, like I was being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. I got into my car and started the engine, but just as I was about to pull away, my phone rang with a new order notification. I wasn't sure if it was a glitch, but the order was from the same address. My heart skipped a beat. I double-checked the address to make sure it wasn't a mistake, but it was definitely the same rundown house. I tried calling the customer to confirm if there had been an error, but the call went straight to voicemail. Hesitant, but unable to turn down the work, I drove back. When I arrived, the door was wide open, but the man wasn't there. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the porch, holding the new order. The food I had delivered earlier was still sitting on the doorstep, untouched. The pizza was cold, the sides completely still. It was like no one had even gone near it. I knocked on the door again, but no one answered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had this horrible feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there, but I couldn't just leave. The customer had paid for the food, and I had to finish the job. I left the new order by the door, just like the first one, and decided to leave. But as I turned to walk back to my car, I heard a faint voice coming from inside the house. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out the words, but it sounded like someone whispering. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way anyone could be inside. I had just delivered food, and the man had been standing right in front of me. I quickly got in my car and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. But as I drove away, I noticed something. A small flickering light appeared in the window of the house. It was like someone had turned on a lamp inside, but when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, but the unease stayed with me the entire drive home. The next day I was scheduled for another shift. I tried to forget about what had happened the night before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then, as if by fate, I got another order. The same address. The same order. It wasn't even an hour since I had left. I stared at my phone, the weight of it all sinking in. I knew I shouldn't go back, but the payment was already processed and I couldn't afford to lose the tip. I took a deep breath and started the car. The whole drive to the house felt like I was in a trance. My hands were clammy and I was starting to doubt my decision, but I couldn't turn back now. When I arrived, everything was eerily quiet. The door was wide open again, and the food I had left earlier was still there, untouched. I knocked, but there was no answer. I set the food down, just like before, and I noticed the same thing. The man was nowhere to be seen, but there was a faint whispering coming from inside. It was the same voice from last night, and this time it was louder, almost as if it was calling me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and left without looking back, my pulse racing in my chest. I had to get away from that place. But as I drove, something strange happened. I looked at my rearview mirror and swore I saw a figure standing in the window of the house. It was just a silhouette, but I knew it was the man. And his smile. That smile was etched into my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I kept thinking about the man, his smile, and the food that never seemed to be eaten. Something wasn't right. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if I was dealing with something far worse. All I knew was that I couldn't go back there again. But the calls kept coming. The next day, I got another order from the same house. The system had sent me another notification, and my phone buzzed with the same address. I felt sick to my stomach just seeing it. I called the manager, explaining everything that had happened, but they brushed it off, telling me it was just a glitch in the system. They said it was probably a mistake and I shouldn't worry about it, but I knew it wasn't a mistake. I took a few days off after that, hoping the orders would stop. I tried to forget everything, but I couldn't. I kept having nightmares about that house, the man's smile, and the food that was never eaten. It was like I was trapped in a loop, forced to return to the same place over and over again. And then, one night, the orders stopped. I haven't received a single one from that house since. It's been months now, and I still don't understand what happened. The house is still there, abandoned and decaying, but I haven't seen the man again. I don't know if I was just losing my mind, or if something darker was at play. All I know is that I'll never forget that feeling. The feeling of being watched, of being caught in something that I couldn't explain. I'm still haunted by it, and I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of it. My name is Mike. I'm 29 years old and I work as a delivery driver in Detroit, Michigan. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me about 6 months ago, and to this day, every time I pass by that place, a strange feeling takes over me. It was a night like any other, where I was making food deliveries for an app. But this delivery, well, this one was different, and it's one of those stories I can't explain to this day. That night, I was making my last delivery and, as usual, following the route between the buildings downtown in Detroit. The city has that unique energy, but it also has its darker corners, those places where you pass by and feel like something's not quite right. When I turned onto the street of the building I was heading to, I immediately noticed the place had a gloomy feel to it. It was an old building with a somewhat decaying facade, dirty windows and peeling paint. The kind of building where you just know you're not welcome, you know? I saw the apartment number and immediately felt suspicious. I didn't know exactly why, but something bothered me. The delivery number was for apartment 7C, a slightly higher floor with a horrible view of the city. I went up in the elevator, which felt like it could collapse at any moment, and the damn thing made that unbearable noise, like it was begging to be retired. On the floor of the delivery, the hallway was dark, poorly lit, with flickering lights that gave a sense of abandonment. Just looking at it, you could feel that place hadn't seen life in a long time. I reached the door of apartment 7C and pressed the intercom. The system was outdated with that muffled sound, and before I could even take a second look at the apartment number, someone answered. The voice on the other side is what gave me chills. It was a cold, low, almost whispering voice. The person said, "Leave the food at the door. I'm already waiting." Strange, I thought, but didn't think much of it. People have their ways, especially when they don't want to interact. But there was something about that voice. It didn't seem normal. I can't explain it. It was like something was wrong, like that simple "I'm already waiting" carried a heavier weight than it should have. I decided to leave the food at the door, knocking twice as I always do. When I turned to leave, something made me look back. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I looked. The door was there, motionless, but the feeling that something or someone was watching me was indescribable. I took a deep breath and decided I was overthinking, so I continued my way to the elevator. It wasn't the first time something gave me the chills, but somehow the feeling that something was off in this building made me uneasy. However, what really made me stop was when I looked at the list of orders on the app. I went to check the next order and glanced at 7C again. That's when the shock hit. Apartment 7C was listed as vacant in the system, with no residents. And the strangest part, it hadn't been occupied by anyone in months, since the last tenant moved out. You know, that kind of data you easily find in the system, indicating that no one lives there. How could someone have ordered food from a vacant apartment? I stopped walking down the hall and stood there for a moment, staring at my phone screen, trying to make sense of it. It didn't add up. I had spoken to someone. The voice was there, clear and loud. How could that be? I started to get nervous. The information was all there, right in my hand. The address, the customer's name, and the notice that the apartment was empty. I went back to the door hesitantly, looking around. What was I hoping to find? Maybe a reasonable explanation. I was desperate for any logical explanation, but there was nothing. There was no one at the door, and the food I had left was simply gone. And the worst part, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no sound of a door closing, nothing to indicate that anyone had taken the food. I stood there, looking around, and the hallway seemed even emptier than before. It couldn't be. This wasn't possible. I was still in shock, but decided to head back to the elevator and leave. I didn't want to be there anymore. However, something made me stop again. What was I doing? How had I spoken to someone in that apartment if it was empty? How had the food disappeared without anyone even leaving the door? At that point, I was starting to feel real fear. I took a deep breath, tried to calm down, and headed for the exit, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me back. I decided to call the building's front desk, but to my surprise, the building didn't have a doorman. There was a sign at the entrance with an emergency number, which I called. An elderly woman answered. When I explained what happened, she was silent for a moment. She asked me to wait. She came back with a trembling voice and said, "Sir, apartment 7C is vacant. No one has lived there for more than a year." The air left my lungs. I knew something was wrong. I knew I wasn't imagining things. But how could someone have placed an order from that apartment? How had I spoken to someone? That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was a prank, someone with an emergency phone number and a strange voice, but it didn't make sense. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I went back to the building, even though I knew it was a terrible idea. The hallway was even darker, if that was possible. The lights were flickering, and the sense that something was wrong was stronger than ever. I knocked on the door of apartment 7C. Nothing. I rang the intercom. The silence was complete. No answer. I stood there for a while, waiting for something to happen, but there was no sound, no movement. I looked around, and the building was empty, lifeless. Before leaving, I saw an elderly woman who lived on the floor above. She seemed nervous, almost uncomfortable. I asked her about apartment 7C and what she knew about it. She seemed to want to avoid the conversation, but I insisted. Finally, she said, "You should stay away from that place. Strange things happen there. It's not a good place." I couldn't understand what she meant, but without giving me an explanation, she walked away and quickly entered her apartment, closing the door in a hurry. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that night. I don't know what happened in that apartment. I don't know who was there or how. But what unsettles me the most is that every time I pass by that building, I feel like something or someone is watching me. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a hallucination, if it was all in my head, but what if it wasn't? There's no explanation. I know what I saw, what I heard, and to this day, when I pass by the building, I get a chill, like something is still waiting for me. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I know what happened, and I'll never forget. My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old and I live in Springfield, Illinois. I work as a delivery driver for one of those delivery apps, the well-known ones where you can order anything and someone will bring it to your door. I was used to quick deliveries, the fast pace and interactions with strangers, which are usually brief and impersonal. I never imagined that one night something would happen that would completely change the way I see my job. It was a Thursday, almost midnight. I was heading to my last delivery of the day. The sky was overcast and the city seemed emptier than usual. It was late and the streets were almost empty. When I looked at my app, I received a notification for an urgent order. The distance was a little longer, but the payment was worth it. Without thinking too much, I accepted. I'm not one to turn down work, especially when the pay is good. The order was made by someone whose name I didn't recognize, but the message was clear. Please be quick. I'm in a hurry. I found the tone of the message strange, but the customer's voice, who called right after, sounded even stranger. It was a low, almost muffled voice, as if they were in a closed space or whispering to avoid being heard. They practically begged me to get there as fast as possible. At the time, I felt a little uncomfortable, but I followed the protocol, grabbed the order, and headed to the address. The location was in a more remote part of Springfield. I didn't usually go that way, as the neighborhood is known for being isolated, with a few houses and abandoned lots. The road to get there gave me the feeling that something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly made my stomach churn. The road was almost deserted, and as I got closer to the address, the streetlights began to disappear. When I arrived, the street was completely dark, except for a dim light on the porch of an old-looking house. I was overcome by a feeling of discomfort. I got out of the car, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the order and headed toward the door. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. The woman who answered was visibly nervous. Her face was partially hidden by the shadow, but her eyes were wide open, as if she was about to panic at any moment. "Please, come in quickly," she said, pulling me inside. The urgent tone in her voice made me hesitate, but for some reason, I entered. The house was strangely dark. The lights were off, and there was only a weak lamp illuminating the corner of the room. The woman seemed even more tense inside the house, as if she was constantly looking over her shoulder. She barely looked at me when I entered, but quickly shut the door behind me, locking it. "There's someone outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt a chill run down my spine. She was visibly scared, and suddenly the air inside the house became thick, filled with a kind of tension that I couldn't identify. "He's watching me. He's out there, on the street." She pointed to the window in the living room. I saw him. I saw his eyes looking at me. I tried to calm her down, explaining that it was probably a misunderstanding. Who could be watching her? But she didn't seem willing to listen. Her body was rigid, her eyes fixed on something outside the window. That's when I looked to the side and realized that there were no more lights on the street, just darkness. The feeling that something was wrong intensified, but I didn't know what it was. What unsettled me most was that the woman seemed so sure of what she was saying. She told me she had heard footsteps around the house and that at night she always felt a presence there, watching her. I looked out the window and at first glance I didn't see anything. Just the backyard, dark and empty. "It must be your imagination," I said, trying to offer a logical explanation, but something told me it wasn't. The woman shook her head. "I'm not crazy. I saw him. I saw his eyes." It was then that her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and turned pale. Without saying a word, she handed the phone to me. It was a text message. "Are you alone? I'm watching you now." There was no sender. Just that. That's when I started to panic. "Who is this person?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she replied, "but he knows where I am. He always knows." The house, which before seemed like just a place of work, now felt like a nightmare. The feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I knew something was wrong, but what could I do? I was there to deliver the order, nothing more. As she grew more desperate, her phone rang again. The woman almost jumped in fright. She quickly glanced at the screen and swallowed hard. "He's saying he's near." I wanted to leave, but I was trapped. I didn't know what to do, so I asked if she wanted me to call the police. She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes were fixed on the window. "If you call the police," she whispered, "he'll come in. He's already inside." At that moment, I didn't know what to do anymore. Fear took over me too. I began to hear a noise, something from upstairs, like someone was moving up there. I froze for a few seconds until the woman grabbed me roughly. "You need to leave now." She pushed me toward the door, but I didn't want to leave alone. I tried to ask what was going on, but she didn't answer. I didn't know what was happening in that house, and even more, I didn't know if I was in danger. When I went out to the car, holding the order, the atmosphere seemed thicker than ever. The wind was stronger, and the sound of nature around me seemed amplified, as if the atmosphere had changed. I ran to the car, got in, started the engine, and almost drove off without thinking. The phone rang again. It was the customer's number. I answered, thinking it might be something important. But the voice on the other end was calm and unhurried, as if there was no sense of urgency. "Is she there?" he asked. I hung up immediately, my body shaking. The voice was the same as before, but now it sounded even colder. Who was that man? What did he want? I called the app support, not knowing what else to do. I explained what had happened, and they asked me to wait while they checked the order details. When they called me back, they told me that the name on the order didn't match the name of the registered customer, and that the phone number wasn't linked to the account. That made me even more scared. Who was that woman? And who was the man watching me if he wasn't the customer? In the following days, I tried to go back to the area during the day, just to see the house from afar. When I arrived, the house was empty, with the yard completely abandoned, the windows broken, and the door ajar. I asked a few neighbors and learned that no one had lived there for months, and no one knew who it belonged to. They said the house had been for sale for some time but hadn't been bought. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know how the order was placed, who made it, or how they knew I would be there. All I know is that, somehow, someone watched me and led me to that place. The woman hasn't been seen anywhere since that day. And that man, well, I still don't know who he was, but his presence still haunts me. Since then, I try not to make deliveries to isolated places, and whenever something feels out of the ordinary, I can't help but feel like something is watching me, as if somehow that man is still out there. I can't explain what happened, but it still follows me. My name is John. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Chicago, Illinois. I've been working as a food delivery driver for almost 10 years, but what happened to me that night still gives me chills just thinking about it. It was about 5 years ago, on one of those nights with heavy rain, where you can barely see a hand in front of you. I've never been one to believe in supernatural things, but what happened was so strange that to this day I can't find an explanation. It was around 11 p.m, and I was already thinking about finishing my shift. The rain was hitting the city hard, and the traffic had died down a lot. That's when I got an order on my app. An address I'd never seen before, a building in an area I knew was under construction. I thought it was strange because who would order food from a place like that? But I accepted the order. After all, it was just one more delivery before heading home. I arrived at the location about 20 minutes later. The building was practically deserted, surrounded by those security gates they put up during construction. It looked abandoned. There was a big sign saying the place was under renovation and an improvised entrance with wooden planks. I didn't see anyone around, no security, nothing. I grabbed the food, looked around and thought, this place is weird, but I'll leave the order at the entrance and leave. Just as I was about to decide, my phone rang. The call came from an unknown number. I answered, somewhat hesitant, and a deep, calm male voice spoke, "Leave the food on the upper floor, please." I replied that the place seemed empty and asked if he could come down, but he just repeated, "On the upper floor, please." The call ended soon after. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the building, wondering if it was worth the risk. But you know how it is. The rating on the app matters, and I didn't want any trouble with the customer. I entered the building. Inside, the place was even stranger. The corridor was partially lit by some temporary lamps hanging from the ceiling, and there was dust and debris all over the place. The smell was a mix of cement and wet wood. It didn't seem like a place where anyone was living or working, but I kept going. A narrow staircase led to the upper floor. As I climbed, I heard some noises that made me stop. It sounded like light footsteps or something dragging on the floor, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. I tried to ignore it and kept climbing, the sound seeming to fade into the damp air. When I reached the second floor, what I saw was even more unsettling. The space was large, empty, filled with exposed columns and beams. It looked like they had started the renovation, but somehow the place didn't feel like a construction site. It was as if time had stopped there, as if the place had lost its purpose. The most disturbing part was the absolute silence, except for sounds coming from the back of the corridor. Faint, muffled laughter, like children were playing somewhere in the distance. Those laughs didn't seem natural. They sounded forced, with something strange and unsettling about them. I stood still for a moment, listening. The sound came from more than one place at the same time, but I couldn't pinpoint where exactly. I looked around, expecting to see some children playing or someone there, but there was no one. The corridor was empty. Only the laughter and whispers echoed. With each step I took, the noise seemed to move, as if it was following me. My breath became heavier, and I started to feel a strange sensation, as if the space around me was closing in. I decided to leave the food on the ground, near the wall, and take a photo as proof of delivery, as I always do. But something made me hesitate. The wooden chair that was in the center of the room. It was facing the window, as if someone was waiting for something. I found that completely out of place, as if it were there on purpose, like a sign. The feeling of being watched intensified. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I approached the chair. At that moment, I heard a much stronger sound, like something dragging, but it was now very close, right behind me. That sound made me turn around quickly, but there was nothing there, no one in the corridor. I was alone. But that laughter, kept going. It wasn't laughter of happiness, but something more, disguised. It was coming from all directions. I could feel I was being surrounded by something I didn't understand, something beyond normal. My phone was in my hand, but for some reason I couldn't take a photo. The phone just froze. The screen went black and didn't respond. It was as if the device had been affected somehow. My fingers trembled as I tried to dial again. Nothing. I started feeling a tension in the air, something heavy, as if the temperature in the place had suddenly dropped. The cold that overtook my body didn't feel natural. In the distance, at the end of the corridor, the laughter intensified, but something had changed. It wasn't children's laughter anymore. It now seemed more distant, as if something was approaching me. A deep, dragging sound, even heavier. I tried to run back to the stairs, but each step I took felt more difficult. The corridor stretched longer than usual, and with every movement, the sound of something dragging behind me grew louder. When I finally reached the stairs, I looked back and saw a shadow, a figure that seemed to move quickly. I couldn't distinguish anything besides a dark shape, but from the time I spent staring, I felt there was someone there, following me. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want to stay. When I reached the ground floor, I was sweating cold. The building's door was ajar, but it seemed like something was preventing it from opening fully. I looked around, searching for a quick way out, and then I heard the dragging sound again, but this time it was much closer. The sensation of being watched only grew stronger. I looked at my phone again, and it came back to life. It lit up, and the first thing that appeared was a notification saying the order had been cancelled. The strangest part was that I still had the order in my hand, and I hadn't received any confirmation that it had been delivered. I ran out of the building, not looking back. When I passed through the door, I took a quick look inside, and the lights on the upper floor were flickering, as if someone were messing with the switch. But they quickly went out completely. The street was empty and silent, as if the very environment was at rest. What bothered me the most was that as I drove back home, one thought kept fixed in my mind. How can someone cancel an order after asking me to deliver it to such an isolated, strange place? And why were there laughs in that building? Children? No, it didn't make sense. The next morning I looked up the address on my GPS, but what I found only confused me more. The building no longer appeared. When I tried searching for the street name, it seemed to have disappeared. Just an area under renovation on the map, as if the place had never existed. I remembered looking up the building on the internet, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced anything strange there, but I found nothing. A few weeks later, I passed by the same street. The building was there, but there were no signs of construction. No signs. No indication that the place had ever been active, just emptiness. And since then, I never got another order for that location. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was imagining the laughter, or if something really was happening there. But to this day, whenever I pass by an empty or strange place, an uneasy feeling takes over me, as if that night never ended, as if that presence is still watching me. I've never accepted an order without checking the address beforehand. Never again. I still think about it sometimes, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank on me, but the laughter, the whispers, and that strange silence still disturb me. I've never told anyone this story, but I needed to share it here. If anyone has gone through something similar, please let me know. I need to know I'm not going crazy.